Imagine the person who knows you best, right? Like someone with a master's degree in child psychology.
That is a very specific kind of expertise to have in your corner.
It is. But then imagine them using that exact clinical training to engineer a terrifying midnight SWAT raid on your home.
Which is just, I mean, it's almost impossible to even picture.
Yeah, but that is the reality we are diving into today. You are joining us for a deep dive into this profoundly intense, really singular source.
Right, it's a very heavy document.
It really is. It's a public YouTube video transcript. It's titled Dear Carla, and it was uploaded by a channel called Emory Dawn.
And it operates as this sort of open letter, right?
Exactly. It's a wife and mother addressing her estranged mother-in-law, Carla, and her sister-in-law, Catherine.
But right at the top, I mean, we really need to set the parameters for our discussion today.
Yeah, definitely. We have to be clear about that.
Because the material we are exploring, it contains some very severe allegations. The narrator details a 13-year estrangement and allegations of systemic corruption involving law enforcement and profound generational abuse.
Yeah, it covers a lot of really dark territory.
It does. And as your guides on this deep dive, we are not here to take sides. We aren't here to independently verify these specific claims or act as a jury.
Right, we're just looking at the source material.
Exactly. We are impartially reporting the narrator's lived experience exactly as she shared it, just to understand the underlying human psychology.
And the mechanics of the conflict she describes, right? Because to do that, we are applying this framework we call the decompose and distill method.
I love that approach for this kind of complex material.
Me too. So first, we will decompose the intricate web of this family's toxicity and the alleged smear campaigns.
Right, breaking down all those layers.
Yeah. And then we will distill the core lessons about boundaries and cycle breaking for you to actually think about in your own life.
Because surviving a conflict of this magnitude, I mean, it requires a complete rewiring of how you interact with the world.
It totally does. It requires an entirely different psychological toolkit.
And to understand how the narrator arrived at this place of definitive peace, we first have to understand the environment that necessitated it.
Yeah, the catalyst for this public letter, which was a relentless 13-year smear campaign against her and her husband, Micah.
13 years. I mean, just think about that. 13 years of silence while someone else writes the script of your life.
It's exhausting to even think about. The narrator describes the absolute shock of realizing that from the very beginning of her marriage, her husband's family was actively slandering them.
And they weren't just, gossiping behind closed doors.
No, they were reaching out to government officials, feigning this deep concern for the safety of the narrator and her daughter.
Which is where it crosses a major line.
Huge line. And the tactic at the center of this, according to the narrator, is something she calls masking and performing.
Right, and this is where we see the intersection of clinical knowledge and manipulative behavior.
Yes.
Because the narrator highlights that Carla, her mother-in-law, holds a master's degree in child psychology.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because this detail, it's what makes the dynamic so insidious,
And it really is the linchpin of the whole thing.
Yeah, the narrator claims Carla uses this education not to heal people, but to project this loving savior persona. She basically studies people to fake the emotion of empathy.
It's a performance of goodness.
Exactly. It's like an usness becoming the fire chief. They know exactly how the systems work. They know how the fire moves, which makes them incredibly dangerous.
That is a terrifying analogy, but it fits perfectly.
But wait, I have to stop you there. Because I understand faking a smile at a dinner party, right? But how does someone maintain a highly educated costume of a caring professional for 13 years? Doesn't the mask ever slip?
What's fascinating here is the difference between effective empathy and cognitive empathy.
Oh, okay. Break that down for me.
So effective empathy is what most of us feel. When you see someone cry, you feel a pang of sadness in your own chest. You actually share the emotion.
Right. It's an involuntary reaction.
Exactly. Cognitive empathy, however, is simply understanding that someone is sad without necessarily feeling it yourself.
Wow. Okay, so it's intellectual rather than emotional?
Yes. And a clinical education in psychology provides a masterclass in cognitive empathy. You learn the exact diagnostic criteria for goodness.
You literally learn the vocabulary of concern.
Precisely. You learn the appropriate facial expressions, the structural expectations of a healthy relationship. For someone who lacks genuine effective empathy, that education just becomes an operational manual.
That is so dark. They aren't feeling the emotion. They're just executing a script.
Exactly. And you've probably encountered a milder version of this in your own life.
Oh, for sure. Like that one coworker who knows exactly the right HR buzzwords to sound incredibly supportive in an email, but actively sabotages your projects behind the scenes?
Yes. They know the language of safety, but they use it as a weapon.
It's chilling.
Mm.
And in this closed family ecosystem, Carla allegedly surrounds herself with people who just buy into the performance. People willing to sacrifice anyone to stay in her good graces.
But the narrator and her husband, Micah, they presented a unique threat to that system.
Yeah, they are what the narrator calls truth tellers.
Right. They didn't buy the script. They saw the reality behind the mask.
And that is the absolute greatest threat to a narcissistic dynamic, isn't it?
Oh, completely. If your entire power structure relies on performing a role, the person who simply observes you accurately is suddenly public enemy number one.
Because the narcissist doesn't fear an attacker, they fear a witness.
Exactly. Because the narrator and Micah were living a thriving, peaceful life that completely contradicted the family's lies, they had to be discredited at all costs.
Which explains the escalation, because the internal family gossip clearly wasn't enough to break the narrator's marriage.
So the masking behavior had to turn outward.
Right. And this is where the story shifts from, toxic family dynamic to a catastrophic weaponization of public institutions.
We move from interpersonal manipulation into the realm of systemic failure.
And it is terrifying. The narrator details how the family allegedly began knowingly making false reports to authorities.
Serious reports, too.
Extremely serious, accusing her and Micah of manufacturing and distributing heroin and meth across the country.
Which is just an unfathomable accusation to throw at a family.
And the result of those fabrications was very real, very physical trauma. The narrator describes a terrifying raid.
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier.
Doors bashed in during the middle of the night, guns drawn. She was slammed onto the ground, her arms jerked violently up behind her back by a sheriff's deputy.
All while her young child is watching and crying in terror.
Exactly. It's a horrific scene.
The clinical precision required to engineer that moment is staggering. The family basically used the state's monopoly on force as a proxy to inflict trauma they couldn't deliver themselves.
Yeah, they let the police do the dirty work. And honestly, it gets even darker when we look at how the system failed the children inside Carla's own home.
Right, because there were adopted children living there.
Yes. The narrator brings up Jackson, adopted child in Carla's care. Jackson actually tried to report the abuse he was suffering.
Which takes so much courage for a kid to do.
It really does. He ran away and hid outside in the freezing snow for 6 hours. He risked hypothermia just to get away.
That poor kid.
And what happened? The narrator claims Carla used her credentials and community standing to entirely discredit him. She had him thrown into a mental hospital.
It's just devastating.
She specifically calls out the Wayne County Sheriff's Department and Richland County DCFS for failing to investigate properly, alleging that records were falsified and evidence was planted.
This is a textbook example of how manipulative dynamics exploit systemic blind spots.
How so?
Well, by adopting children who have already experienced early childhood trauma, the abuser creates a built-in defense mechanism.
Oh, wow. I see where you're going with this.
Yeah. When the child exhibits severe distress or cries out for help, the abuser simply points to the child's pre-existing trauma as the cause.
They use the child's tragic history as a shield against their own current actions.
Yeah,
That is so calculated.
it really is.
But I struggle to understand the sheer mechanics of that systemic failure. Like, how does a child fleeing into the freezing snow for 6 hours get brushed off by authorities as, and this is a direct quote from the letter, poorly planning an escape?
It defies common sense, doesn't it?
It totally does. The system operates like an automated spam filter, right? It looks for specific keywords. Carla has the credentials, the calm demeanor, the vocabulary of a clinical professional.
So the algorithm categorizes her as safe.
Exactly. Meanwhile, Jackson's erratic, traumatized behavior triggers the danger or unreliable filter. It's a system running on heuristics with absolutely no human intuition.
That is exactly how institutional betrayal functions. Social workers and law enforcement are often overworked and under-resourced.
Right, they have huge caseloads.
Yes, forcing them to rely on those exact shortcuts, or heuristics you just mentioned. When they are presented with a well-spoken, educated adult, especially one holding a master's in child psychology, The system defaults to the authority figure.
It assumes the performance of goodness is actual goodness.
Exactly. The narrator is highlighting a terrifying reality here. Systems designed to protect the vulnerable are incredibly susceptible to manipulation by those who simply know the right words to say.
It's incredibly frustrating. But, surviving a physical SWAT raid or watching the system fail around you, that's just surviving the external attack.
There's an internal battle, too.
A much deeper one. The more complex question is how Micah, the narrator's husband, survived growing up inside the very house that engineered all of this.
That is the real miracle of this story.
How do you survive that immense pressure without replicating the abuse? Because Micah grew up in the dead center of this environment.
This brings us to the psychological concept of the cycle breaker. And to really grasp the magnitude of what Micah accomplished, we have to look at the specific mechanics of his upbringing.
The contrast the narrator draws is just stark. She details a childhood from Micah where terror was entirely conflated with love.
He was systematically broken down psychologically.
Yeah, he was constantly called stupid, lazy, a dummy. He had food withheld as punishment. He was hit in the face, spanked publicly.
Just relentless abuse.
And he was regularly asked chilling questions by the adults supposed to protect him. Questions like, do you want to die? Or want me to knock your teeth down your throat?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, breaking a cycle of generational trauma of that severity is a monumental neurological feat.
Neurological.
Yeah.
Like on a physical brain level.
Yes, exactly. Our brains are heavily wired by our early childhood experiences, the neural pathways that govern our fight or flight response, our attachment styles, our baseline for stress. They are formed when we are entirely dependent on our caregivers.
So Micah's brain was basically hardwired for danger.
Exactly. For Micah, his physiological baseline was programmed for constant threat. His blueprint for parenting was written in fear, shame, and absolute obedience driven by violence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like Micah was handed the blueprints to build a torture chamber.
That's a powerful way to put it.
He had the schematics, he had the raw materials. It was the only architecture he had ever been exposed to. And somehow, using those exact same raw materials, he built a sanctuary for his daughter, Grace.
He completely rewrote the code.
He really did.
Yeah.
The narrator points out that Micah never raises his voice to Grace. He calls her princess. They have daily dance parties. They laugh nonstop.
That is just beautiful.
It is. Their home is completely free of shame, guilt, name-calling, spanking, or hitting.
To achieve that, Micah didn't just decide to be a nice guy one day, He had to actively override his own central nervous system.
Right. It's not just a mindset shift.
No, it's physiological. When a child spills a glass of milk, a person raised in severe trauma might experience an immediate, intense spike in cortisol.
Their amygdala signals danger.
Exactly. And the ingrained response is to yell or punish to regain control. For Micah to look at a spilled glass of milk, suppress that physiological spike, and gently say, "Let's clean this up together," it requires an exhausting, deliberate rewiring of his brain.
It is an active daily practice of emotional regulation.
Yeah, it's incredibly hard work.
And the success of that rewiring is perfectly captured in one specific anecdote the narrator shares. It's actually kind of wild.
Oh, about the visit.
Yeah. Carla actually came to visit them once, and she started rummaging through their kitchen drawers, trying to find a wooden spoon to hit her own adopted children with.
Just a completely normalized behavior for her.
Right. But Grace, Micah's daughter, was utterly shocked. She had absolutely no concept of physical punishment.
Which is amazing.
The idea that an adult would use a kitchen utensil to inflict pain was completely alien to her.
Grace's genuine confusion is the ultimate metric of success for a cycle breaker. The trauma stopped before it ever reached her.
It really did. And the narrator also touches on the mechanics of how that trauma was justified in the first place, specifically noting her severe critique of how religion was weaponized.
Right. That adds a whole other layer.
She describes how the Bible was used to excuse hateful behavior and enforce unquestioning obedience, basically teaching innocent children that they are inherent sinners who don't deserve love.
It was another layer of systemic control, but this time it was spiritual.
Yeah, which makes it so much harder to fight against.
It adds a layer of divine authority to the abuse, making it even harder for a child to question the reality they're presented with. Breaking free from that requires dismantling not just your family structure, but your entire cosmological worldview.
That is incredibly heavy. But building that peaceful sanctuary for Grace is only the first half of the equation, right?
True. You have to protect it, too.
Exactly. Maintaining it especially when it is under constant external siege from a family actively trying to tear it down with SWAT raids and smear campaigns, requires something else entirely.
It requires an impenetrable boundary.
And the narrator's approach to boundary setting in the latter half of the letter is profound because it defies our standard instincts about conflict resolution.
She really flips the script on how we usually handle these things.
She points out this incredible irony. The smear campaign, all the lies, all the tactics used to make her feel isolated, they actually had a massive upside.
Which sounds counterintuitive at first.
It does. But they successfully kept Carla away from Grace. Because Grace was isolated from this toxic family dynamic, she developed a healthy, strong self-confidence and amazing boundaries of her own.
The isolation became a shield.
Yes.
Yes.
The narrator essentially looks at 13 years of slander and says, "Thank you for the protection."
She reframes the isolation entirely. It is no longer a punishment inflicted upon her. It is a fortress that allowed her child to thrive.
And she is incredibly firm that her 13 years of silence was not cowardice. She explicitly states she refused to lower herself to the level of people she believes do not deserve her attention.
She refuses to give them power by reacting.
Exactly. She fully trusts that the energy spent trying to tear her family apart will only shift to their benefit.
This is the core distillation of radical peace. When you are the target of a narcissistic smear campaign, the most natural human instinct is to defend your reputation.
Oh, absolutely. You want to clear your name.
You want to scream your truth, present your evidence, and prove the abuser wrong to everyone who will listen. But the narrator recognized the hidden trap there.
Engaging in the battle validates the abuser's premise.
Exactly. It feeds the toxic dynamic by providing them with the reaction they are desperately trying to elicit.
So what does this all mean? Like, if you are listening right now and you are dealing with a manipulator in your own life, maybe a toxic workplace, a difficult family member, or a smear campaign in your social circle, how do you practically implement this without feeling like you are just lying down and taking the abuse?
Right, because ignoring it can sometimes feel like surrendering.
It really can.
This raises an important question about the mechanics of a true boundary. Setting a boundary like the narrator did is not passive submission. It is a highly active, heavily fortified position.
Okay, so how do you do it?
You implement this by recognizing a fundamental truth. You cannot control another person's narrative about you, especially if they are highly motivated to misunderstand you.
You can't out-argue someone who is committed to a script.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So instead of exhausting your central nervous system trying to convince an abuser of your worth or proving your innocence to a community that has already bought into the mask, you reclaim all of that energy.
You just pull it back.
You pull it inward. You use what therapists often call the gray rock method.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, you become as uninteresting and unresponsive to the abuser as a gray rock, essentially starving the conflict of oxygen. And you pour all of that saved energy into your sanctuary.
You focus entirely on the people who see your truth.
Yes. You make your life so full and so peaceful that their toxicity simply has no mechanism to affect you anymore.
You essentially rendered them obsolete in your own reality.
Exactly.
Wow. Well, today we took a really intense piece of source material and walked through the decompose and distill process.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We decomposed the anatomy of a 13-year smear campaign, breaking down the chilling mechanics of cognitive empathy and masking.
Which is such a vital concept to understand.
It really is.
Yeah.
We looked clinically at the terrifying reality of systemic failures, how algorithms of institutional trust can be so easily manipulated by the mere performance of goodness, leaving vulnerable kids like Jackson out in the snow.
A truly heartbreaking reality.
Yeah. And we explore the immense neurological heavy lifting required to break a cycle of generational trauma, using the blueprints of a torture chamber to build a sanctuary.
Micah's strength in that is just incredible.
And finally, we distilled the active, unyielding power of radical peace and boundaries.
And, while you will hopefully never face the extreme level of defamation detailed in this transcript, the underlying mechanics apply everywhere.
They really do.
Protecting your peace, refusing to donate your energy to toxic narratives, and actively choosing not to pass down inherited pain. These are the essential tools for constructing a resilient life.
Which brings us to a final thought I want to leave you with today. We spend so much time worrying about the obvious villains in our society, right? The ones who look the part.
The loud ones.
Yeah. But looking at how easily the systems in this story were manipulated, it leaves you wondering, if our institutions, Our social workers and our law enforcement are so easily swayed by the mere vocabulary of empathy and the performance of goodness. How much of our society's safety net is actually just a stage for predators who simply learn the right script?
That is a deeply unsettling but very necessary question to consider.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this heavy but deeply illuminating deep dive. Take care of yourselves and take care of your peace.